Um, 7:30 in the morning, August 29th, 1997, Columbus, Ohio, at the 12th Armored Division. We're talking to Donald Mercier. Sir, just tell us where you were born, what you did growing up, high school, what your parents did.
Okay, I was born on February 1st, 1922 in Rice Lake, Wisconsin. Little town in northwest Wisconsin, about 5,000 people. Went to grade school and high school there, and attended part-time for my dad, who owned the tavern at that time. After that, it was Depression time. When I left high school, there were really no jobs in the area, and I didn't know where to go anyway, so I signed up for the National Youth Administration, which is a depression project, and for 25 cents an hour I washed walls in public buildings. Well, we got tired of that, so I joined the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, and went to Menominee, Wisconsin, where for 3 months, and it was in the winter, I worked in a rock quarry. Now, I was too small to handle the wheelbarrow and too small to handle the sledgehammer, so they gave me a pair of safety goggles and some tongs, and I held on to the chisel so it would, when the guy hit it with the maul, it would, not wobble. After 3 months of that, they asked who could type, and I raised my hand, and I ended up going in the back end of a Army 4x4, which just had a canvas top, 20-degree below weather, and went down to Sparta, Wisconsin, which was the headquarters for Wisconsin CCC, and learned how to be a radio operator with the Morse code. And after that, my cousin, they thought we were twins, but we weren't, asked me to go down to Norfolk, Virginia with him because he had the prospects of a job for $10 that we could ride with this guy. So we went down there, and I did get a job. He didn't get one right away, so he left. Turned out he had a girlfriend back home, which I didn't know about. So I was down in Norfolk. I had been in the seas alone, and now I was down in Norfolk alone. So I worked for the Naval Air Transportation there on the base. My boss was a civilian, and his boss was a Lieutenant JG in the Navy, transportation area. So I got tired of that and went back to Rice Lake and asked him if he wouldn't enlist in the Army with me because we were going to go anyway. We knew that. In 1941, when the Japs hit Pearl Harbor, I can remember it just like it was yesterday. It was a Sunday morning, and Dad and I were cleaning up the tavern, and it came in on the radio. It was at that time then that we enlisted in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and they sent us down to the Naval Air Station in Chicago, and from there they sent us to Camp Campbell, Kentucky.
What did your mother do growing up?
My mother?
Yes, sir.
She was a farm girl. My dad, when he was growing up, was, I believe, a painter. And he and his brothers, he had quite a few brothers, the big family, would paint like farms in the area and also houses.
You mentioned your cousin. Did you have any brothers or sisters?
I had one brother, and I'll tell about him later, and two sisters, one older and one younger.
So what's the first thing you remember about getting to Camp Campbell?
Well, in a way, I was lucky that I had joined the 3 Cs because when you had pretty much military training of some sort there already, so that when I got to Camp Campbell, it kind of fit right in for me, and I didn't bother me at all. It was got to be a little more routine, and you had many more inspections, and obviously you learned how to be a soldier and how to clean and handle weapons. You had to learn how to dismantle and put together your weapon practically blindfolded. And you met a lot of people. You started out with your own barracks, you might say. There were quite a few in a barracks. And then you joined a platoon of men. In our case, a platoon would have been 5 tanks of 5 men each. So, and then there were 3 platoons in a company, so you became very familiar, mostly with your platoon, but also with the rest in the company.
What do you remember being the hardest thing about basic?
About basic? I don't know. I can remember one time I decided I didn't want to go to the motor pool with the rest of the guys for gun instruction, so I snuck back into the barracks and put on my dress uniform and went into town, which, isn't like me. I don't know why I did that. But anyway, the MPs didn't catch me, so I got by okay. But the next morning when the Sarge said, some guys think they're too good for class, they might get in trouble, I got the message. Actually, when we did the obstacle course, I enjoyed that. I really enjoyed that. There wasn't really anything I disliked except that when we first started out, we were in a medium tank outfit. And the medium tank we had was an old-timer. It only had 1 gun on the side, and it was really old, but we did practice with that a little bit. Just had 1 for the whole outfit. But then eventually we got our full complement of tanks. A company had about 17 medium tanks. And we'd go out on runs and stuff like that, and you'd come in at night and you had to go through and clean up all of your guns, and oil them, and clean the tank, and in the wintertime that got a little messy. It was cold. That was the worst thing, I think. And of course, missing home. I think a lot of guys missed home a lot more than I did, especially if they were married or had a girlfriend.
You said you and your cousin joined at the same time?
Yes.
Did he come down to Camp Campbell?
He came to Camp Campbell with me, but he went into the 92nd Reconnaissance, and I went into the 44th Armored Regiment. And I mentioned this to him not too long ago. I says, Ralph, when I think about it, we hardly ever saw each other at Camp Campbell, and I'm not sure exactly why. We were so close. Don't know why. It turned out that after basic training, our 44th Armored Regiment was a part of the 12th Armored Division, and we trained on maneuvers. Well, first we had a 2-week Hellcat camp, which was basically a test of the men and equipment, into battle-type situations. I can remember it was so dusty that when the tanks rolled through a dry area like that, the dust would roll in clouds. And we'd get done at night and we'd take our goggles off, and this part was clean, but everything else was covered with dust. We'd drink about 6 Cokes before we quenched our thirst. After that, we went on maneuvers. And there again, you're spending a different night in a different place, and you don't have a base at all. You're out in the country, every day. And it turns out that our unit, Company C, the whole 44th Armored Regiment, turned out to be an outstanding unit. The men worked well together, and we were recognized for that.
Who do you remember being your buddy, or who you hung out with during?
Okay. Well, of course, your first buddies are the men in your tank. 5 of us, except that I was a gunner in the first tank and the first platoon. So my tank commander was a lieutenant. So obviously you don't buddy with him. He's always with the officers, so that left our crew, the 4 of us. Very close buddies. And then it works right down the platoon. Our platoon was very close. For some reason, somebody named me Mo. And that name has stuck with me even today at the reunions. They call me Mo. And nobody knows where it came from, so it's been a mystery. But you become very close, especially when we went through the war, 18 months training and 18 months fighting, you become very close, very close. It's much more than going to college or school with somebody. When you go to war with them, you're with them night and day. Not only that, you depend on each other for your, for coming out alive. So you become very close.
What do you remember being the most memorable thing that sticks out in your mind about the Hellcat camp?
Hellcat camp? The night drives. You drove at night with blackout, and you had to change the crew would rotate. Not much, but enough so that if our driver got killed, everybody could drive that tank. And I remember you'd do a road march at night, and you'd get so tired. And the time I was driving it, I was sitting there, and you got the driving bars like this, and I could see the tank ahead of me. He'd go off to the side, and he'd be clipping fence posts and telephone posts, and the sparks would be flying all over. Well, obviously, he fell asleep, but that woke him up. And I'd almost fall asleep, and the exhaust from the tank in front of me is what would alert me to that. You get up, you go to bed, and then it's you don't still get your full complement of sleep. You're up the next morning ready to go.
How long were you all on? You said you went on maneuvers. Was that the Tennessee maneuvers?
Yes, Tennessee, Kentucky. That must have been July, October, probably 2 months. And then after maneuvers on the 11th of November, 1943. See, I had gone to Camp Campbell in October of 42, so this was over a year later. Our unit, the 44th Armored Regiment, became the 44th Tank Battalion. What happened is, apparently they needed a full armor battalion for some kind of a project. And so they separated us from the 12th. It turned out we went from there to Camp Barkley, Texas, and trained. And it turned out that from Camp Barkley, the 12th Armored Division, less the 44th Armored Regiment, which was now the 44th Tank Battalion, went to Europe, and we eventually went to the South Pacific. While we were in Barkley, at one time they sent the gunners and the tank commanders to Fort Bliss, New Mexico, I think it is, or Texas. Texas?
It's
right on the border, I guess.
both.
And we were supposed to go to gunnery school, and they'd have these little airplanes, you know, the Cessnas or whatever they call them, civilian-type planes, pulling targets. And we were supposed to have 3 days of that training. Well, in 2 days we shot down all the targets, so we went back to camp. The other thing that happened in Barkley was my tank crew, I think it was could have been 4 tanks, I'm not exactly sure, went to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And the purpose of that trip, they loaded us on flat cars. The purpose of that trip was they had quite a few American and Allied generals there. And we were to put on a demonstration to prove that 105 artillery that had a timed fuse to explode above our tanks wouldn't hurt us, but could kill any enemy troops around us, see, so that they couldn't, say, put a bomb on us or anything. Well, they didn't know whether it would hurt us or not. It turned out that it didn't hurt, but when the shells explode, you could feel your pants go like that from the concussion. And it so happened that there was this large sandy hill, and because it was so sandy, as we were going up and my tank driver made kind of a turn, one of the tracks came off. Normally you have to have the mechanics come and put it back on, but what he did a reverse twist and he got the thing back on. Probably didn't lose 2 minutes. It was really something. You know, he had to be pretty good to do that. So then we were going up again, and I had blank shells for my 75 millimeter, and one of them exploded. Well, of course, we got the concussion from that because it was in the tank, and we got singed. Our hair and our eyebrows got singed, and we were all full of soot. And I can remember my assistant gunner he's the guy that loads the ammunition in, was sitting next to me, and he says, "Am I dead?" He wasn't. From there, of course, then we left that area while the 12th was still there and went to by train up to Vancouver Barracks, Washington, and I can remember like stopping in Denver on the way, and that night just to get out of the cars and get our exercise, we would march around the area and the people would watch us go by. Then up in Vancouver we got issued our summer issue clothing, and that was the first time that we had seen wax. That was the first time that we saw women in the Army.
What do you remember most about Camp Barkley there in Abilene?
Well, the most memorable experience, of course, was the time we went to Fort Sill. It was there that some of my buddies had their wives come down, or their girlfriends, and they'd go to town as often as they can. That was also the first time, excuse me, that we got issued what we call grease guns. It was a little round gun, about that big around and about that long, and then a short barrel, probably 12 inches long, and then a 30 round clip that hung below, and you'd throw the strap over your shoulder. Well, just last night we were talking about those little grease guns, we called them, that when you'd pull the trigger with 30 rounds in it, by the time you got done, it was way up here. The other thing is, when we got overseas, I didn't like this clip hanging down, because one guy jumped off the back of a truck, and the bolt inside of the gun went forward when he hit the ground, and went back up and came back down and put a bullet through his leg. So when we got overseas, one of the first things I did was trade that for a 45 automatic revolver that I, not automatic, 45 revolver that I could have in a holster and not have to worry about losing that clip. Of course, that's about it about Camp Barkley. We still did some further training, and it turned out it was in the winter, and they have harsh winters down there in Abilene, Texas, too.
Did y'all get to go into town much when you was in Abilene?
I didn't.
You didn't?
Like I say, my buddies, a lot of them had wives or girlfriends, and being unattached, I didn't go much.
So out of Vancouver, how did y'all get into the Pacific Theater?
We did get a little R&R there in Vancouver. From Vancouver, most of that was to just get your new issue, I think. I don't recall any particular training there. Then we went to Portland, Oregon, and that's where we shipped overseas. We boarded a 10,000-ton Dutch freighter that had been converted to a troop ship, and I think it carried our unit and another unit. Our unit was about 800 strong, and the other unit must have been about that or a little more. At the time that we boarded the Cotabaru, when we hit the ocean swells, most of us had never been really on the ocean, and the swells made everyone seasick. Well, almost. I remember that I personally didn't get seasick, but those who did. The latrines were up in the front end of the prow of the boat on both sides of the deck there, and you'd go in, and there'd be 3 heads over one stool all trying to vomit at the same time, and some of the guys got so sick they passed out and they were laying on the floor in this stuff going back. Ugh. Terrible thing. Like I say, I was lucky I didn't get sick.
So how long were y'all on the boat getting over there?
Well, that was unusual. We were on the boat. We got off once, I think, for a mail call when first we went down to San Francisco to take on fuel. And I can still remember when we went under the Golden Gate Bridge, we were standing there on deck saying, well, I wonder where we're going, and I wonder who will come back. That was the first thing on our minds. Well, it turned out that 52 days later, after zigzagging across the Pacific all by itself, this one ship, no other escorts, after 52 days, we got to Finchhaven, New Guinea, and that was where Camp Washington, I believe it was, a disembarking camp, where you could first come ashore. And it was pouring rain, and you had your duffel bag and your sidearm, and we jumped off the back of those trucks and in the mud that you sunk into about a foot deep. They had to have wooden sidewalks in the camp and tents, and I can still remember sitting in those tents and watching that rain pour down. It was just unbelievable.
What did y'all do after Camp Washington? Where'd y'all go?
Well, you remember, well, I'll point out that, first of all, the battalion consisted of 6 companies. It was, a little more than that. Battalion headquarters, a small unit that was the command, and we had a medical detachment of a few men. Then we had companies A, B, and C, which were medium tank companies, and there were about 17 tanks in each. And then there was D company, which had light tanks. And so you had all those 6, well, from headquarters and service, and A, B, C, and D were the more or less the fighting units. The A, B, C, and D were the fighting units. The other 2 supported us. So out of that whole group, Company C, which was my company, was the first one to leave and go into combat. And what we did then is we went wherever the infantry got bogged down, and they just, because it was such rocky and hilly and jungle in that, if they'd get bogged down, they couldn't go any further, so they'd call our tanks in. Well, we'd board a landing ship tank to get to where they were, and then we'd start working our way in to get behind them and support them with our arm, with our 75 and 30 calibers. And they were real happy to see us, especially because at that time they'd gone as far as they could, and they've lost a lot of men already. One of the saddest memories I have of the war is to sit there. I saw the war through a periscope. You have to imagine, it's this big. Whatever was in front of my eyes is what I could see. And I could see these infantrymen sloshing through that mud. And to me, they looked exhausted all the time. I really felt sorry for those guys. And here I could sit in the tank and I could hear the bullets hit, but rifles or machine guns didn't bother us unless it hit the periscope. So we worked our way up the coast of New Guinea. Most of the time we were next to rivers, and I can't remember how many or how long, but we went in June of '44, and June and July we were fighting our way up. At night along the rivers, if we had, because we were a small unit, say 1 company, the infantry didn't want us around at night. They maintained that we drew mortar fire, which turned out not to be true. But on the other hand, we found out that if we did camp along with other units, they'd be trigger happy at night and you couldn't get to sleep. At least when we were off by ourselves, we'd post our own guards, and we felt confident enough about each other that we could, sleep good at night. And along the rivers, the mosquitoes were so bad that you'd put this stuff on your hands to keep them away, but the rest of yourself you'd cover, pull everything down and put on a raincoat in this hot weather just to keep the mosquitoes off. When we first got there, they issued Atabrine, and you were supposed to take 1 Atabrine a day, and I did religiously. So what happens is it turns your skin yellow eventually. Really weird. But in one of the rivers there, I remember, I did get dengue fever, which they call the bone breaker, but it lasted a little better than a day, and it didn't incapacitate me in any way, but you suffer. And it was there that on one of the rivers, they called us again for help, and I think they took just my tank and put it on a little barge and they brought us around the river because it was too deep to cross, and we landed on a little beach that was a narrow beach, probably 25 yards deep and long, and there was kind of a cliff there that was probably 20 feet high that the infantrymen were hiding behind. And what had happened is they had got trapped by a Japanese unit, and the snipers were picking them off. So after we landed, we just shot up into the trees and that, and then their commanding officer, I forget if he was a lieutenant or what, got into our tank, and we drove up and down a little bit so he could see, and I can remember him crying when he saw his men laying there dead, so many of them. Boy, I tell you. So we got back there, and it was getting dark by then, and you worry about snipers, of course, so you don't stick your head out. So we buttoned it up tight that night. And here again, this is in the South Pacific. I tell you, it was really hot. So my assistant driver got sick. And he had taken a salt pill. So here we sat in there all night long with that, results of that. So when the morning came, we opened up, and it was pretty quiet by then, and by then he had pulled all of his men back that he could, so we got back and went back over to the camp. From the New Guinea then, right after that couple months, we went to a rest camp, and they were always welcome. That was our first break, really. All the while that we were in New Guinea, we were within rifle fire of the Japs. I mean, at any one of the camps that we were, if our rest camp is right on the beach, you might say, near the beach. And we did a lot of swimming during the day if we weren't on call. And we'd even, we had, at that time, at those camps, you would have a tent, and you would have a cot with a little mattress on it. And there was a cotton cover on the mattress. And what we'd do is we'd take them off and get them wet and run and fill them with air and then tie them. And even though it wasn't tied tight, it would hold enough air that you could swim out into the ocean and catch a wave and ride it back. That was really nice. That was fun. But like I say, all the while you worried about snipers and that. So after rest camp then, in September 15th, they put us aboard LSTs again, just Company C again, where once we left the battalion, we were by ourselves. All the time we had to do our own perimeter guarding, you know. But we went to the island of Mortai, which at that time was a small island, the furthest island into Jap-held territory and the furthest away from American troops. And we landed with the Marines. And again, you see the Stars and Stripes newspaper come out. The Marines land on Mortai. You don't ever hear anything about the 44th, which makes sense because we were such a small unit. Nobody even knew about it. But that became one of my missions in life later on, is to get the proper credit for the 44th, because we were really not properly recognized, and we did our share. So anyway, the island of Mortai was, the people there, instead of being Negroid like in New Guinea, were more the Polynesian type. They were, you could say, attractive people, both the men and the women. And there, the water was so clear and pure, you know, it was almost like a paradise island compared to what we'd been in. And so they needed somebody to go up and knock out a radar station at the north end of the island, so my tank and 3 others got assigned to that, and they put us on a little 4-unit LST again, and we went up there. And when we went to land, because of the coral rocks underneath, they couldn't figure out where to land our tanks, so we'd dive under the water. It turned out there was no opposition there to begin with, so we'd dive under the water and find a way that the craft could pull up to the beach and we could put the tanks ashore. And when we got in there, we destroyed the radar station, but like I say, there was no opposition, so we went back down. And that was the area on Mortai where they had Well, we were only 12 miles from the Jap-held island of Halmahera, and they must have had an airstrip there because they'd come and strafe and bomb us, you know, all day long and all night long. I mean, we had a great big bunker that you could go into, but it was low, so you'd have to stoop over. And one guy, he liked to lay in his bunk during the day without any clothes on, being it was so warm, and so it turned out on one air raid, he was the first guy in, going in like this. Company commander was right behind him, and of course, when the guy stopped, why, the company commander ran into his rear end. That was funny because I could still hear that. After we got out, our captain says, "Barentine, after this you wear pants." So there are some humorous incidents that you can really remember. So after Morotai, you want me to keep on like
yes,
this?
Sir. You're doing great.
After Morotai, which was, well, that's the place too where, again, the cooks hadn't, if the cooks came with us, I don't remember. It seems to me we were scrounging food from the other units. So one night, 6 of us took our flashlights and we went on the road, and these landing ships, or these little army ducks, they're an amphibious vehicle. They had wheels and were shaped like a boat. And they'd drive out next to the Liberty ships and they unload food in them. And then they'd drive ashore and drive to the ration dump. So we had 2 guys flag them down, one of them. And while the 2 guys were talking to the driver and assistant driver, asking directions to get somewhere, the 4 of us, the rest of us, were unloading the back end. We actually had better food than we'd ever seen. A wooden box with a slab of bacon packed in salt, a carton of fruit cocktail, stuff you'd never see. We ate pretty good there for a while. So after Morotai, we got on our Liberty ship again. This time it was a Liberty ship, I think. And we were headed back to New Guinea. And we were heading for Zanzibar. And they told us that the sailors like to get after you, you know. They told us that when we'd get to Zanzibar, that it was 30,000 Japanese Imperial Guards there that were going to meet us, and that the place was overrun with typhus, which was a bad news. Turned out when we got there, it was a rest area and a training camp again. Any time you got into a rest area, you went over your equipment and then you updated your skills. One of the things they did there is they put snorkels on our tanks. That's 2 vents that went up about 6 feet and curved forwards, so that technically it said we could go into water 8 feet deep, which would have covered all of the motor and parts like that. So we were hoping we didn't ever have to use them. Turned out that Zanzibar was the training area getting us ready to go back to the Philippines. I don't know if you remember, but in World War II, when MacArthur was chased out of the Philippines, one of his famous statements was, "I shall return." Well, from Zanzibar, now, meanwhile, this is Company C I'm talking about. All the rest of the battalion, of the 44th Tank Battalion, were doing their own thing in other islands and in other parts of New Guinea. On Leyte, our 44th Tank Battalion were the first Americans into the capital city of Tacloban on Leyte, and they did made names for themselves in other areas, and we hadn't seen them at all. And so we got on board this convoy. Well, before we got on board, December 25th, we had a Christmas dinner. It was the only really big meal we had all the while we were over there, but it was sure turkey dinner and everything. So the next day we boarded, and this was a 900-ship convoy, the largest convoy to date in the war. And it turned out that after we left New Guinea to go to the Philippines, they had one of the roughest storms, you know. And I can still remember that you'd be on deck and you would look one minute, the ship next to you would be like way down in the trough. The next minute you would look, he'd be way up on the tip of the wave. So it was really a rough seas. But worse than that was the kamikazes, the Japanese suicide planes. They were equipped with machine guns and bombs, and the pilot had dedicated themselves. So they'd first they'd strafe the planes, and then they'd bomb the ships, then they'd bomb the ships, and then they'd dive into them. And you wouldn't believe all the dots up in the sky from the guns that were shooting, because then they'd explode up in the air. And still some of those planes could get through that. A lot of them would get shot down, but those that got through would dive into the ships, and we were fortunate they never hit our ship, but you could see them hit the others. And we got to Lingayen Gulf in the Philippines, and it was a big bay, and all these ships were congregating there, and that was the first time we saw naval ships that had racks of rockets. Man, that was something to see them shoot those rockets. And with their big guns shelling the shore, and with the airplanes strafing and bombing, it turned out there was no real opposition for him there. So they had the ramp on my LST open so that we could walk out and stand there and look at the shore. And that's when I saw MacArthur go by with his crew or whoever accompanied him in a naval launch. And there was a pier there that I guess the Seabees had put up, but instead he had them stop out in the water and he waded ashore because he knew the cameras that were there waiting for him. And that particular picture was on the front page of Time or Life magazine, and I saw that picture later, and I could actually point to myself on the front of that LST, but you wouldn't know it was me because it's too small, but that was kind of interesting to see that. I saw MacArthur one other time in a parade in Milwaukee. So when our unit, Company C of the 44th, landed there in Lingayen Gulf, and Luzon, the island of Luzon, the big island, Manila was the capital. As soon as we landed, we kind of made a left turn and then a right turn and went up into the mountains. The rest of the whole battalion landed 2 days later, and they headed towards Manila. This was told to me by a man who actually participated in what later became known as the Flying Column. The Japanese had over about 3,700 American and Allied prisoners in the Santo Tomas University compound, and they were on the verge of starvation, and MacArthur knew this. You know, he'd been in contact with them all this time, and he had somebody from the 1st Cavalry put together a 3-prong column to race in over, well, almost 100 miles to go in there and rescue them. And he says, don't stop and do any fighting, just go. And they did this day and night for 72 hours and rescued those people. And one of the captains who was there at the time that MacArthur was giving him the instructions, he said that MacArthur didn't talk to the troops. He would talk to his aide, and his aide would talk to the troops, and then it would go back that way. That's kind of interesting. But our fighting was done in the mountains there, and I think that our experiences in the Philippines were as bad as it was in New Guinea. It got a little worse. The Japs would dig in on the side of a hill. They'd have bunkers, and the infantry could attack them, and you'd think it was all over, and the next time you made an attack, they would still be resisting. So that's when they would call for us. And fortunately, on some of our tanks and some of the infantrymen had flamethrowers, and that's a terrible thing too, you can imagine. But these guys were in caves, and the only way you could get in them, if you could shell in the cave, they could still hide back in the corners. But when you went in there and used a flamethrower, it would eat up all the oxygen, and they'd suffocate and burn. And there was one time there on Luzon where we had a night battle. We were just parts of my company this time were parked along a highway, and Munaz, one of the cities, was down the road, and the Japs were surrounded, and they had to get out of there, and they were trying to save what little armor they had left, so they were going to escape. And I can still remember when the first tank rumbled by, and we saw the silhouette, we knew right away. And as he got past, the tank on the far left opened up and stopped him. And the tank right behind him, one of the tankers got him. Well, that stopped the whole convoy. Well, they were just kind of sitting there wondering what to do, and we were sitting there wondering what they were going to do. And so my tank had been hit with an armor piercing that afternoon, and it was crippled. Nothing was damaged except the sprockets, so we had kind of limped back to camp. So my tank was facing the way they had come from. So I jumped into the assistant driver's hatch or seat, and I was going to man that 30 caliber machine gun, right, that I had like this. And I looked up and I looked at that moon, and I thought, I'll bet you my face is reflecting that moonlight. I'll be a perfect target. So I quickly climbed out and hit the ground, and the minute my feet hit the ground, there was an explosion above me. And the next morning I went and I looked, and there was a hole that big in the hatch. I was right. I'd have been a perfect target. So what made me get out of there? Luck. In that battle, it was, as we understand it, the largest armored battle of the Pacific at that time. We knocked out 10 of their mediums, 1 light tank, and about 4 other vehicles, and killed 245 Japs. We lost 1 man and had 11 wounded. And the funny part of that is that the shrapnel went and just cut up a lot of our gear, you know. And I still today, right now, have the guidon, which is a little flag each company has. I still have that guidon from that time, and that has shrapnel holes in it, which I hope to give to the museum.
That'd be awesome.
There was one other battle there that we had. We'd been on we knew that there was some Japs in a certain area. What you'd do is different units went into different areas. So we were called on to join a platoon of 105 millimeter armored, I don't know, they weren't tanks. They were open on the top, but they had this 105 cannon, but they had tracks in that. So the 5 there and 5 there were lined up on the hill, and out in front of us, all of a sudden, 250 yards away, perfect range, a troop of Japanese was going by. So we waited until they got all lined up, and the guy says, when we start firing, you join us. So when I fired the first shot, everybody opened up, and it seemed that line of men just disappeared. So another sad story was that the guys, there were some infantry. There's always infantry around you, see. Well, the infantry guy wanted to send a couple scouts down there to see if the Japs were, if there were any left down there, and we could see this. We were watching it. We could see the 2 guys walking down, and we could see 2 Japanese sneaking up, coming to them. So my tank commander says, let us shoot, we'll kill those Japs, and he wouldn't do it. And I knew we could do that. We could have killed those Japs, and I'm sorry now to this day that I just didn't let them have it and tell them to go to hell. But it turned out the Japanese surprised them and killed both those guys. And so somebody sent one of our tanks down, and they threw the bodies on the top of the tanks, the back deck. And I still remember as they came in and their feet were hanging over and flopping like that, and I said, why? For what? You know, it didn't make sense. So anyway, we made camp that night. And that was the first night that we had ever experienced rocket fire. One of the most fearsome things. First you hear the shriek of this rocket going through from the tube up into the air. And then when it'd get up, it'd make this, hit the apex and come down. You could hear it going like that. And the explosion was unbelievable. Well, they were 6 feet long and maybe 1.5 feet in diameter. So that's a big piece of metal. And when it exploded, some of the shrapnel could be like 2 feet long and 3 or 4 inches across could cut a man in half just like nothing. So that night, right away, everybody started digging down, trenches. Even dug the trucks down to protect them a little bit. And the next morning, like when we were at breakfast, and you'd hear a rocket go off, muskets would fly one way and the guys would fly another way heading for a ditch, That was a terrifying experience. After that, pretty much sums up our battles, and we pretty much ended the fighting. We didn't even know what the other guys were doing at this time, and we finally joined them at the end of the war. After the battle for Manila was over, we finally joined them. And that was the first time since we'd got overseas that our battalion was all together again. And then the Filipinos had built little wooden platforms out of bamboo and put tents on them, so we were living pretty well, had decent food for a change. I remember one day we were sitting there talking or playing cards like we usually did, and all of a sudden we heard some screaming, and first thing you think of is somebody went crazy, because we did have a couple men do that. But it turned out that they'd heard the news over the radio that the Japanese had surrendered. Well, that was the greatest thing for us. And it wasn't until just recently now that I read an article that said the end of World War II, and this whole article outlined the invasion plans for Japan. And what nobody knew at that time is that the Japanese were in a much stronger position than the Allies knew. And it wasn't until they started listening to the radio, Japanese radios at the end of the war, and then later on uncovered secret documents, that they found out that the Japanese were so well prepared for a landing that they think it would have been the bloodiest battle of all the wars. So we were very happy at that time, without even this knowledge, that the Americans had dropped the atomic bombs.
You said you were really happy when that happened. Do you remember what the natives, like there on the islands, felt like when they heard that it was over?
Well, I'm sure they were very happy. It turned out that when the rest of our unit was fighting in the southern part of Manila, after they had released these hostages, which they really became famous for, this flying column, and there again the 1st Cav got all our credit for that, and the 44th Tank Battalion wasn't even mentioned until later, when one of the guerrillas who had led the flying column, because they'd got lost, flying column to the gates, and it turned out the guerrilla told them that the 44th Tank Battalion was the tank that broke through, that they weren't the 1st Cav, it was the 44th Tank Battalion. So that's when then we started getting our recognition. But the battle for Manila, it turns out as the Japanese were trying to escape the advance of the Americans, were destroying Manila. They burned it and they bombed it. And not only that, they were massacring the civilians. They were brutal. And they think that there was only the battle for Warsaw in Europe that was any bloodier than the battle for Manila, because of the way the enemy retreated. So it was very discouraging for me when in 1995 Peter Jennings from ABC was talking in his documentary about the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima, and saying that the Americans were the aggressor and the Japanese were the victims. I'm going to send him a copy of this. I wrote him a letter at that time. He chastised the veterans for being upset about this Smithsonian Institute portrayal of, the Americans as the aggressor in Japan. So I'm going to send him a copy of that. It's all relatively new information. Had been secret.
What do you remember about getting back to the States?
Well, it turned out that after the war was over, September 15th in that area, our unit went to the whole 44th then went to Japan as occupation troops. I can still remember when we unloaded from the LSTs and went up these streets in Japan. It was Yokohama probably, and we ended up in Tokyo. All the Japanese people, the kids and the adults, waving little American flags and bowing as we went by. When we moved to Tokyo, then I and 3 or 4 other guys we decided to write a history of our company, because being all by ourselves, nobody really knew what we did. We knew the battalion would have a history, so we wrote our own. So we dealt with Japanese civilians in a printing company there, and they were very nice. We explained to them that, they weren't going to like what they read, and they said, yes, we know. But they did a good job of printing our magazine for us, or our history, and they even invited us to their plant where they printed it, put out a nice dinner for us, and actually brought us up to their roof garden where they had a theater and put on a little opera for us. Very nice. One night I was sergeant of the guard in Tokyo, and they brought me 2 men who had stolen, I think, a ham. And the young guy was very arrogant. He was very aloof and arrogant. The older gentleman, he was scared to death, naturally. And so it was winter, cold yet, and he volunteered by motioning and bowing and all that he would keep the fire going. So after the guard duty, I put him in the back of the truck with the men that had been on guard, and on the way I didn't know what to do with the guys. So on the way I pulled the truck over and had him get out the back and took my revolver and waved it at him and hollered at him as if to tell him, don't do this again. So then I sent the young guy off, and after he was gone I gave the old man the ham. I thought that would be a gesture, to show him that all the Americans weren't bad. He took it and ran. Then was about in December, then I had enough points to go home. You went home based on the points that you were earned and whether you were married, and the married men went home first. So I went home in the middle of December and went by boat 2 weeks. San Francisco by train to Fort McCoy in Wisconsin, Camp McCoy, and then from there by bus back home. And it was just after Christmas when I got home with my duffel bag. I had a Jap rifle and Japanese saber that I had accumulated as booty. And my parents met me there, and there was this tall guy there. I didn't know who he was. So I kissed the folks, and we started to go, and the tall guy says, well, aren't you going to say hello to me? It turned out it was my younger brother. He still remembers that to this day.
Probably holds it against you too, doesn't he?
Not really. No, we were pretty close. After the Army, or after the war, then I remember Wisconsin had a 20-20, $20 for 20 weeks. I went to join the VFW, or American Legion, and they were bickering of who they were going to take, so I said, that's not for me. And I worked a few months for my dad tending bar, and then I went to school on the GI Bill. Graduated from the University of Wisconsin in Madison.
Do you have any questions? Anything else that you remember there, Don?
Yeah, one time on New Guinea, we were in a rest area, and the GIs always used to say you could tell the tankers because their clothes were always so dirty. So what we did from the grease and oil and that is we'd fill a pot with gasoline, which is bad news to begin with, and lighted a fire and put a pot of boiling, get the water boiling and boil our clothes. Well, we had been told, if your pot burns out, don't put gasoline into a hot pot, so I knew that. And usually in those kind of areas, all we wore was Army shoes and socks and shorts. That's all we wore. And I was standing there alongside my tent, and I saw this guy pouring that gas. I hollered at him, I said, don't put that gas in that hot can. What I didn't know is I was standing in the fumes. And when they blew, my legs from here down got burned quite badly. And so they took me to the medics right away, and they gave me a shot of morphine. And after they did that and bandaged me, they brought me back to my cot. And I was laying there on the cot, and all of a sudden, moaning because I was really in pain. All of a sudden, I sat up laughing. That's how quick the morphine would work. And we all loved volleyball over there at that time, and of course, I couldn't play. So the company commander would send his Jeep over, and they'd put me in the front seat, drive me over there, and I'd sit along and watch them play. Wasn't long I was out there, bandages or no. And then about the morphine, it reminds me that the night battle there, when after I got out of that tank, I heard somebody holler, and I went over, and Barentine had been hit in the heel. So I dragged him into a shed there, and I gave him a shot of morphine. And that was the only time I ever gave anybody morphine. And I often wondered if I'd be able to because it was so dull. But when you have to, you have to. I've never seen Barentine, but I have been in contact with him. We have our Army reunions every year. And after you've had them for a while, you become like a family. And I guess that ought to end the story right there. What's that?
How old were you when you joined the Army?
When I joined, it was 1942, so I was 20. And we went in October of 42 and came out in December of 45. So it was a little over 3 years.
Well, that's all we've got for you.